Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a lot of registrations for this event, and so as we allow everybody to connect and to settle in, please take a second, if you would, to enter your name, the organization that you're with, the city that you're dialing in from into the chat, please. And we'll begin in just a few seconds. Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Marjan Essassi. I'm the Executive Director of the Federation for Innovation and Democracy in North America, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this conversation today. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Schmidt, the Senior Director of the Political Reform Program at New America, who will kick us off.
Thank you very much, Marjan. As Marjan said, I'm Mark Schmidt. I created and direct the political reform program here at New America, which we're really thrilled to have the privilege of hosting this and other meetings on this topic, along with my colleague Holly Russell-Gilman, who I think is on a flight at the moment, so can't be with us today. But she's really our leader on this work, and we're the hosts as much as a Zoom conference can have a host. I think, as we look at what's going on in the United States today, and in many ways across the democratic world, we are seeing a kind of crisis of not just an anti-incumbent wave, but a real crisis of trust in institutions. And I think a sense that democracy doesn't mean a lot to people. It's a set of abstractions that people aren't quite connecting with. That was one of my big takeaways from the U.S. election. So I think a really important innovation is anything that can get people's hands more directly on the process of collective decision making and give people agency in the decisions that shape their lives. And we've really found that citizen assemblies, which is a really broad model for a really broad term for a set of ideas and models, is a really wonderful way to begin to do that. So the role we've played, along with the co-organizers of this event, which is FIDE North America and Columbia World Project, the role we played is really to try to learn as much as we can about these processes as they've taken place, particularly in Europe and Latin America, and as they're beginning to pop up in the United States, and just absorb as much as we can and try to share that knowledge out so that we figure out how to do this as well as possible. So we're thrilled to have you all here. This seminar is very much part of that process, and we hope it's a kind of a two-way learning experience. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Marjan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. I too wanted to start by thanking New America and Columbia World Projects for truly a fantastic partnership. I want to thank in particular Mark. Thanks so much, Mark, Holly Russell-Gilman, and Sarah Jacob at New America, as well as Tom Asher and Anna Marchesi at Columbia World Projects. We kicked off this series of webinars called Elections Beyond, I should know this, no, Democracy Beyond Elections, last fall as an additional resource as interest in citizens' assemblies was increasingly growing in the United States. And for this discussion, as Mark mentioned, we really wanted to focus on public trust and institutional legitimacy. And the conversation is especially timely given the context in the United States over this past week with an outgoing administration and an incoming one. And across the world, we are witnessing an anti-incumbent moment. But regardless of how each of us feels about these developments, there is one factor that remains constant, and that is the lack of trust in political institutions, in government, in elected leaders. And so we wanted to engage in this conversation with a desire to really add a new dimension to this conversation and to put it in the context of citizens' assemblies and what they might offer by way of a solution. And so we're thrilled to have this terrific panel of experts with us today. On the one hand, we have the OECD represented by two brilliant policy analysts, Olin Perez-Reynaud and Emma Phillips. Thank you so much for being with us. The quantitative work of the OECD is well known, and we'll be discussing their contributions in deliberative democracy, as well as their more recent report on the drivers of trust in public institutions. And Peter McLeod, the founder and principal of MassLBP, the leading and most experienced practitioner of long-form deliberative platforms in North America. There are few people like Peter who consistently offer innovative and truly thoughtful perspectives on the path forward as it relates to engaging with citizens. Based on Peter's 20 years of extensive experience in the space, we're going to ask him to share his unique perspective on trust and how citizens' assemblies can help address some of the challenges that we're discussing today. Before turning to our speakers, I just want to take a second to close the introduction with a bit of an optimistic message, which is truly, while trust is low, and there's no denying that, we are also seeing large numbers of people show up to vote. And what's the number? I think it's 4 billion people who cast a vote in 2024. And so I think that contrary to the messages of citizen disengagement and voter apathy, there should be a new message that people are engaged and that they're actually searching for meaningful platforms. And so this presents all of us with a real opportunity to be really thoughtful and introduce civic practices that are new, including deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies, that really offer consequential space for people to be involved in policy reform. So with that, Olin and Emma, let's get started. The work of your group, Olin, at the OECD on citizen participation is very well regarded. And of course, the Deliberative Wave report that was published in 2020 has been seminal for all of us advocates of citizens' assemblies. So we would love for you to tell us a little bit about what drives your work, your reports, and what you're currently spending your time on. And Emma, you were one of the policy analysts on the drivers of trust in public institutions. Please help us understand the methodology, some of the key findings across OECD countries, and to the extent that you can, whether the US is reflected in these numbers. So with that, I'll turn it to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjan, and it's lovely to be here today. We have prepared a presentation and we have very limited time, so if we could perhaps just prop it on the screen and get right ahead on with the findings. So thank you very much once again. We are here from the OECD Public Governance Directorate, and what Marjan said. What we'll be discussing today is the connection between citizen participation and building trust in public institutions. If we just could move to the next slide, I'll give you a brief introduction of what the OECD is, as we have a very diverse audience in the call. The OECD Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development was founded in 1960. Its agreement coming into force in 61. It is an international organization with 38 member countries, including the USA and Canada, relevant to this call, working to help shape policies that foster prosperity and opportunity underpinned by equality and well-being. Our areas of work are fairly split into three. First of all, we inform and advance policy debates so that members and partners can use OECD knowledge in their policy decisions. We act as a platform to bring stakeholders together to drive progress across different policy areas. And we support setting international standards to level the playing field. This is most often done through non-binding recommendations and declarations. If we could go to the next slide, please. A core axis of the OECD's work on public governance is citizen participation, which the OECD understands as all the ways in which stakeholders, including citizens, can be involved in the policy cycle and in service design and delivery. Mark and Marjan mentioned it already. Globally, we're experiencing democratic backsliding. There is a transition, a very observable transition from democratic optimism to democratic pessimism. However, there are reasons to remain hopeful. Governments around the world continue to move beyond consultations in a more traditional format towards representative deliberative processes as a way to improve citizen participation beyond elections and build social cohesion. Our work, as well as that of experts from across the field, shows that strong citizen participation can be crucial, not only to improve in the democratic policymaking process, but also to deliver better policies and services, strengthen inclusion and diversity, further legitimize policy decisions, and enshrine participation as a right. I should also use this opportunity to establish some brief definitions. We understand deliberation as being part of the whole broad spectrum of participation. And in this really specific set of participation, specific case, Usually we would see a representative group of citizens engaging in careful and informed deliberation as opposed to debates on a specific policy issue to support the preparation of recommendations for typically public officials that are to make a decision. If we could move to the next slide, please. On the screen, you will see some information about some of the work that we do to support public institutions to adopt participatory and deliberative practices. First of all, this work is underpinned by the OECD recommendation on open government, adopted in 2017, which identifies clear and actionable steps to support countries to become more open. Both in terms of open government, open state, and that includes citizen participation. Next slide, please. The OECD has also prepared a toolbox to support policymakers to strengthen deliberative practices and adopt participatory approaches, going from discovering different models of citizen participation and deliberation to better understanding what practices, good practice principles can be adopted to implement a participatory approach, evaluate a deliberative process, and then embed deliberative democracy into our public institutions. The OECD also has developed guidelines for citizen participation processes, where any policymaker, including non-policymakers, anyone that is interested in delivering a participatory process can be informed and inspired by practices from over 15 countries. Next slide, please. Finally, our work in citizen participation includes also informing policy dialogue, like what we are doing today, providing technical assistance to other countries, and also measuring participation, which is the focus of the discussion. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you today about the OECD Deliberative Democracy Database. The database currently includes 732 cases ranging from 1979 to 2023. These cases are collected following a strict set of 3 pillars of criteria. First of all, participants must meet for at least 1 full day to deliberate on either face-to-face or online or specific policy issue. In order to be a representative process, participants must be randomly selected and stratified to be broadly representative of the community they intend to represent. And the process has to be commissioned by a public authority to ensure impact. Some of the findings that we have identified through collecting such cases include the fact that we see that public deliberation, citizen deliberation, continues to grow. Countries continue to have an uptick on this type of participatory approach. In fact, 80,000 citizens, more than 80,000 citizens have been randomly selected to date to participate in a deliberative process. And we now have tracked data from 34 countries, including 96% of the cases that we have in the database being part of the OECD. We also see that deliberation is being used to solve long-term issues. Traditional democratic processes are often limited by policy short-termism because of electoral cycles, most notably. Deliberative democracy is increasingly being used to discuss long-term issues that require complex policy trade-offs. Today, we see that 32% of cases are focused, for example, on the green transition and climate change. Other prominent issues include strategic and urban planning. Digital methods are also becoming central, yet face-to-face deliberation remains the preferred methodology. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a significant uptick in online tools, which are now being used as hybrid for deliberative processes. In fact, today, 40% of processes tracked are communicated through online or digital channels, and social media and dedicated websites are used to amplify and complement these processes. Deliberative democracy can also be more inclusive and impactful than other forms of participation. Emma will speak to this more in her slides, but more traditional forms of participation often receive the criticism of alienating certain population groups, for instance, younger people, lower populations from lower income groups, or lower educational levels. And deliberative processes, usually as participants are selected at random, there is the potential of having a more representative discussion. And also, of the cases that we have tracked, 74% of these participants received a form of compensation to support their participation, which also increases inclusiveness. Deliberative processes also can enable more impact, as public authorities tend to be more responsive, more engaged in the process, and also more likely to implement the recommendations that are provided. Finally, I just want to, if we can go to the last slide, permanent public deliberation is on the rise. Marjan discussed that this is a timely moment to be discussing about deliberative democracy, and some of you may be wondering why. Deliberative processes often happen as an ad hoc process. They are often commissioned by a public authority, and they occur for a concrete process, and then they are finalized. We have been seeing an uptick in institutionalizing public deliberation as more of an integrated form of participation. In fact, deliberative processes that are permanent multiplied between 2020 and 2023, going from 22 to 41 cases. This is crucial both to ensure that political changes in administration do not impact the potential power of deliberative democracy, and they are also essential to ensuring that there is less friction in implementing a deliberative process over the long term. Over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Aline, and I think we can move on to the next slide now on the OECD Trust Survey. And thank you very much for this overview of the OECD's work on deliberative democracy, which, as you'll see, is really pertinent in light of the results of our own survey on drivers of trust in public institutions. As I imagine some of you might not be incredibly familiar with the framework of the survey, I wanted to briefly go over what it measures and how it was implemented. So our starting point is that we view trust in public institutions as, of course, an important input for effective public governance, meaning that it helps governments address challenges, it facilitates compliance, etc. But importantly, we also view public trust as an outcome of sound public governance. And so what this survey does is that on one hand, it measures levels of trust in different public institutions, and on the other, it measures different degrees of satisfaction and perceptions of different aspects of public governance to try and tease out the relationship between the two. And the aspects of public governance that we look at are government responsiveness, reliability, integrity, fairness, and openness. The survey is carried out every 2 years now with OECD member countries. Recently, it was opened up to non-member countries for future waves. The 2023 Trust Survey, which I'll discuss in the next slides, was implemented in October and November of 2023, so important to keep in mind when you're listening to the results. All the data collection dates were very close, so everything is very comparable. We had about 58,000 respondents for the 30 participating countries, which means that the sample is representative of about 600 million people. The samples were representative of the national population by age, by gender, education, income, and region. As you'll see on the slides, you get a sense of the 30 countries which were involved, 20 of which are returning countries from the 2021 exercise, so for which we had a bit more longitudinal data, which was really interesting. As you'll notice, the US is not a part of the 2023 OECD Trust Survey, but we do feel that the overall patterns and trends would be comparable, and so there is value in kind of learning from the results of our other OECD countries. So now we can delve into the actual results, so we can move on to the next slide. So first, I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the overall levels of trust and how that kind of looks depending on the different population groups. Overall, about 39% of people place high to moderately high trust in public institutions. But what we found, which was really interesting when breaking it down into different population groups, was that in the end, political agency tended to have a more significant role than personal characteristics, which could seem counterintuitive. And so what we did find was that 69% of people who feel like people like them have a say in what the government does have high trust in the national government, whereas only 22% of people who feel like people like them don't have a say place high trust. So that's about a 47 percentage point trust gap. It's the largest gap that we saw across all groups. We saw a similarly large gap for confidence in one's ability to participate in politics of about 25 percentage points, whereas gaps that are related to socioeconomic characteristics, so financial concern or even demographic characteristics like gender, were much smaller. That's not to say they're not important. So for example, the gender gap grew quite a bit between the 2021 and 2023 wave. But it is interesting that political agency seems to be a big part of the puzzle here. So we can move on to the next slide now. So this graph is a bit scary, but it's because it's compiling a lot of information. So what this is that we're trying to identify which areas of action have the highest potential to raise levels of trust in different public institutions. And so here, on one hand, we look at which public governance aspects or which drivers of trust are most highly correlated with high trust levels, but also where satisfaction is lower, and so where there's a bigger margin for improvement. And what emerges here again is that political agency and political voice seems to be one of the answers for governments to be able to raise levels of trust or appear as more trustworthy to their population. So we see that this political voice driver, so perception that people like you have a say in what the government does, is an important driver for all three public institutions that we focused on. So civil service, local government, and national government. We see that for trust in the local government, the most important driver is the feeling that you would have an opportunity to voice your opinion on a matter that would affect your local community. And we see that for trust in the national government, in addition to political voice, other factors like the perception that opinions from a public consultation would be adopted, but also your own confidence to participate in politics, also emerge as important drivers where satisfaction remains rather low, and so where there's margin for improvement. So I think it's really interesting that political participation, engagement, all appear, obviously among other drivers, as you can see, but they all appear as a potential tool and a lever for governments. And it's an area where a lot of work could be done and would have positive results. So moving on to the last slide. So as I mentioned, we have on the one hand, the trust levels, we have which aspects of public governance matter most to drive trust, and we have just the more straightforward public perception results. And so here you can see that actually, even though it's an important driver of trust, only about 30% of people believe that the political system allows people like them to have a say in what the government does. And in addition to this, we see that even when inputs from the population are requested, people don't feel confident that the government is actually listening. So only about 37% of people felt that if a majority was against a public policy, that it would be changed. And under a third of people felt that the government would adopt an opinion of a public consultation. So I feel like that's quite worrying. So it means that the perception of these different aspects of public governance, which we have shown are important to drive trust, perceptions are quite low. And as mentioned earlier by the previous speakers, this is in a context where participation in electoral exercises is quite high. We found that about 82% of people participated in their latest national election. But this is clearly insufficient for individuals. So to me, the kind of the juxtaposition of a high participation in elections and low perception of political voice means that there's a need for additional tools, which are not a substitute, obviously, to elections, but serve to complement and to maybe placate this feeling that there's no ability to influence decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma, Olin. What rich information. We could spend an hour. One thing is for sure, we're always way too ambitious with these webinars. We could spend an hour with each one of you. And for the participants, we will be following up with an email to all of you with all of these resources. So you will receive them and you can kind of dig a little deeper in them. So thank you so much to both of you. Let's bring Peter in now. Peter, tell us a little bit about sort of your area of expertise, your current initiatives, and how these findings resonate with you, your work.
Terrific.
Please.
Well, thank you very much, Marjan, and to Olin and Emma. I think the findings from this report are just so helpful, and I want to commend the OECD on all of the work that it's been doing, not just gauging public attitudes and perceptions, but of course, all of the great work that you've done documenting the growing deliberative wave. And as you point out, since the publication of that 2020 report, another 120, another 130 processes joining the database. It's terrific. I want to start by observing that, trust is rightfully a preoccupation of many people looking at the relationship between citizens and government today. Call me a little bit old-fashioned, however, because I tend to think that trust is a two-way street. And so when I look at findings that say 30% of people believe that their governments will actually act on whatever it is they're saying, the question I want to see in this survey isn't asking citizens what they think of their governments, but it's asking governments whether they trust their citizens. And I think we can all probably assume the response to that question, right? That governments, by and large, of all political stripes, have come to hold the public practically in a low regard. They see members of the public as volatile, as ill-informed, as increasingly polarized, and often quite self-interested. And it's a dynamic that I think is underlying a lot of the political syndromes that we're experiencing in this moment that you described as democratic backsliding. I think we have, broadly speaking, amongst liberal democracies, come to see the public less as a resource to learn from, to work with, to achieve social aims, but instead as a risk that needs to be managed. And so if you just take, as the English would say, a bog standard public consultation process, usually it's taking place at the end of the policy development cycle. It's that last item that gets checked off. And what do public servants do? Well, they've already invested in the answer. Political individuals involved, they've invested in the answer. And what they're looking for is not input, but affirmation. And so let's play this one step further, because you end up in the proverbial town hall. It is announced with too little time. People are brought in. They're quickly given, 2 minutes to stand at a microphone in the middle of a hall to say their piece. And let me assure you that most of those individuals are not feeling a great sense of political efficacy in that moment. They're feeling a sense of political futility. So even when we see governments consulting with citizens, engaging with citizens, too often I worry that it is actually eroding a citizen's sense of trust and confidence in government. So we've got this very disabling dynamic of regarding the public as a risk. The more dysfunctional public consultations you run, the more volatile and frustrated the public appears to be. You clamp down even further. So breaking out of this risk-resource dynamic, I think, is really critical to addressing the democratic challenges we face today. And the good news is that we've got a terrific engine for creating at scale a sense of political efficacy. Another way to think about trust too is about capability. Do we regard people as capable? Do we regard governments as capable? And good deliberative processes are a platform where citizens and governments can have a better experience of each other's capability. Now, when we look around the world globally, I want to just distinguish for a moment, because we often think of citizens' assemblies as though they are a monolithic thing. I think if we examine that database, we can see at least 3 different approaches to citizens' assemblies that are answering very different and important political questions. When we look to our friends in Ireland and those countries that are running national citizens' assemblies, they are dealing with political issues that, for a variety of reasons, national governments struggle to address. So they become an extra parliamentary source of legitimacy to address a major, in the case of Ireland, constitutional or quasi-constitutional concern. But the reality is that even in a country like Ireland that's very committed to this work, they're only ever going to be able to run 1 or 2 or 3 of these in any government's term. So it doesn't scale as an approach for Irish citizens to involve themselves. If we move next door to Belgium, of course, we see the same philosophy being used in a different way. And that's about invigorating parliamentary institutions, randomly selecting people to sit on parliamentary committees, elected and selected side by side, working as almost commissions to inform the legislative branch, and that are changing a set of parliamentary dynamics. The opportunity that I think exists in North America, and that we have obviously been pursuing extensively in Canada, is that much wider swath of what we could call regulatory questions or local questions. So municipal land use planning, water regulation, questions about development, questions about service provision, healthcare, education, all of the workaday matters of government, which may not rise to questions of legislative importance, but nevertheless have public authorities making difficult choices and needing to point to a source of public legitimacy. What we see when we impanel citizens to help us work with these very practical questions is, first of all, those citizens consistently putting up their hands to volunteer. People have good noses. They realize that going out to the town hall meeting probably isn't a great use of their time because they understand intuitively that decisions have already been made. But when you give people the chance to do something real, they spring into action. And so consistently, in the 500,000 letters that we've sent to Canadians on 50 different assemblies, we have consistently had a 5 to 7% response rate coming from every socioeconomic and demographic background. And we're not asking people to give us, of course, 90 minutes of their time. We're asking for 4 Saturdays, 6 Saturdays, 8 Saturdays to do good work. And the first thing that every member of every assembly has said to me after that first day is, I had no idea it was so complicated, right? By bringing people in and understanding that there are often few simple answers to questions of governance, people end up having a greater sense of empathy and understanding for the work of government itself. And what my clients say, good public servants all, is I had no idea people were so thoughtful. You see, they've been conditioned to expect the public just to push them for those easy answers. So we're creating a different kind of political space. And what we discover is that people aren't as polarized as the media and our experience of national politics suggests. Instead, we tap into a kind of civic realism, a kind of pragmatism that I think remains the dominant and pervasive force of social organization in our society. I want to conclude by observing that in the 30 years or so that the OECD has been tracking this from the 1970s, 80,000 people globally have participated. That's a great number to have, but I would just observe that that's the same number of electors in a smaller mid-sized city distributed globally. And so even though we are 20 or 30 years into this deliberative wave, we're still very much at the at base camp. And the work of the next 20 years is ensuring that hundreds of thousands and then millions of citizens around the world come to experience what will be the next evolution in our democratic trajectory, voting for the representatives, but also having the opportunity to play the role of public representative themselves.
Peter, thank you so much. Thank you so much for really complimenting the comments from Olin and Emma so well, and reminding us and stressing that we should never think about trust without really considering mutual trust, and trust being a two-way street. So thank you for that, and also for your comments around regulatory work in that space, and how it really opens up many opportunities for us to be able to engage with citizens. And I'm going to ask each of you a quick question, and then we'll turn it to the participants' questions. So please take your time to put your questions in the chat. The first question I have is for Olin and Emma. Given the results, or given the work that you do and the results of the study, do you have any recommendations or advice for elected representatives and public managers in the United States? And also, would love to hear your thoughts on whether, looking at the US, you think that deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies really are more desirable at one level or another of government.
Thank you, Marjan. And if you don't mind, I'll start, and then Emma, I think, can complement as well. Just I'm starting with the second part of your question. I think that there is no right answer to what level of government should include deliberative processes. I think all levels of government should include some form of deliberative democracy, but perhaps that's my bias. Currently, the deliberative democracy database is a majority of local level cases. And I think Emma can comment on this, but there is, local government is what is closest to the people, and therefore there is more opportunity to impact citizens' perceptions of democracy. There was a study that I read a few years ago that looked at the likelihood of democratic participation across levels, and one of the conclusions was that if citizens are encouraged to work or to participate at a local level, they will be more likely to participate up the stream, a regional, national level. So I think that starting from the local and scaling up is always a really good opportunity. However, the US context is very specific, and there could be also national level opportunities to do deliberative democracy. I think one important piece of advice I would say in this transition process is that depoliticizing the discussion of deliberative democracy is paramount. Currently, we have, because of the rather ad hoc nature of deliberative processes, where policymakers use these on a case-by-case basis to answer a policy question, they tend to be associated with the political stripes of the government in which they are operating under. And therefore, the conclusions of a deliberative process don't necessarily carry forward if there is a change in government. So I think that depoliticizing the question or the discussion on citizens' assemblies, deliberative democracy is super important. I think Peter discussed different ways in which this has been institutionalized in Ireland, Belgium, and so on. This is an excellent way of looking at how these processes can be considered as just one more way in which democracy can function, and not necessarily as the pet child or specific brainchild of a specific administration. So I would say bet for institutionalization and build those institutional capacities within your government, including reinforcing capacities of policymakers, also as developing new institutional frameworks to embed deliberation as core part of your government. Emma, I don't know if you want to comment on this.
I'll just add 2 points. So in terms of specifically advice to representatives or even members of the executive, I think what emerges for us from the data is that there's an issue of expectations. So I think what's really important for people interested in carrying out deliberative exercises within their community, regardless of level of government, is that there's a very clear delimitation of what electoral democracy is deciding upon, what deliberative democracy exercises can kind of be used for, because otherwise you run the risk of either having the impression that the government is kind of talking to Paul to avoid taking into account the opinions of John, basically like ignoring electoral results and using deliberative processes to kind of get the outcome that they prefer, or there's a perception of that at the very least. And the the second point, which is not really related to deliberative democracy, but I think is important, is that our question is on whether people feel like people like them have a say in what the government does. It's not specifically on deliberative democracy. And I think that a lot of people feel like that they are voicing their opinion to government through protests, through boycotts, through messaging their politicians, and they feel unheard. So I think it's important for representatives to also take a beat and think, okay, we have all of these institutionalized structures, we have elections, we have a deliberative exercise, we have whatever, a town hall, but who is speaking that I'm not listening to? Like, I think the listening aspect is really important. It's not just creating opportunities for people to speak, it's also actually listening when they're speaking, even when you didn't explicitly ask them to. So this is where
Thank you for that. Peter, I'm actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to you and ask if you'd like to comment on Olin and Emma's response. But I also want to ask you a more specific question as well, which is that, especially in the United States, we talk a lot about the need to protect our democracy and to safeguard our institutions and against all sorts of threats. And the message seems to fail in the sense that it doesn't address the need for a new set of engagement practices. Is this a real tension, or is it not a real tension? And what are your thoughts about how to approach both?
Well, I think there's a tremendous opportunity right now in the United States for these kinds of processes to put deep roots down at the local and state level. I know some of the proponents of this work rightfully aspire to running national assemblies to address questions of major public importance that deserve a good hearing in the United States. Nevertheless, when you think about all of the municipalities, the school boards, the conservation areas, the energy utilities, there is so many public institutions that would benefit and actually have the capacity to convene citizens, to bring them into the work of their own decision making. That I think this is the moment to create an American culture of deliberation and demonstrate its potential before tackling some of those larger national questions. And I mean, look, I get it. It is exciting to talk about national climate policies and what the right approach to regulating AI might be. But for your listeners from the United States right now, I'll provide a quick example of a project that's very relatable to any resident. And that's taking place right now in British Columbia's capital of Victoria, where Victoria and its adjacent city, Saanich, are taking up the very, routine question as to whether it's time for those communities to amalgamate. So they randomly selected 48 citizens to serve over the course of about 10 months. And, the politicians themselves, difficult for them to take up this question because, of course, they would be directly impacted by the result. So they delegated it to local residents. They're holding their own public meetings. They're having the chance to hear from the heads of fire departments and police station or police departments and planning departments. And they're going to bring forward a recommendation. And if they endorse the idea of amalgamation, it'll go to referendum. That's a very practical, tangible example of an issue that I suppose could be ideological, but really is of a more basic importance. And I think those are the right questions now to build up the skills to run these processes well with our US friends.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, so turning to the questions from the participants, I'm going to ask you each a question, which I think is directed at each of you, and then a more general question that's come in. And if you have any thoughts on that, please share them with us. The first question for Emma and Olin is, why isn't the US included in the survey? So if you could kind of, to the extent that you can, address that, please. And then Peter, this question always comes up, especially in the US context, and it is, how do you respond to questions around the cost of doing citizens' assemblies? People argue that they are expensive to run for a specific decision. And then the broader question, and I wonder if any of the three of you have thoughts on, is what are the sources of low trust by public officials, elected and staff in the public? Has there been any study done on this matter? So if you have thoughts, please share those as well. Olin and Emma, why don't you start?
So maybe I'll tackle this question as it relates to the trust survey. So the US administration has been very supportive of the exercise. So the way this is governed is that there's an advisory group which kind of helped us structure the questionnaire, validates the questions, and kind of puts in the political buy-in for this exercise. And the US is part of the advisory group. The chair of our committee was actually American, and it's the OMB within the US administration who's our main counterpart for this. The decision of whether or not to participate is entirely up to the administration, and it has just emerged that from the past two waves, the US was not able to participate. But we have close contact with them, and we're very hopeful that in future waves, they will be able to join us. And we also have ideas on how to bolster the data in the US, as it's such an interesting country that we could run this survey in. And maybe just so I can tackle the second question on why there's so little evidence or research on trust from public officials towards the public. I think partially it's because it's just difficult to study, and few institutions have contacts within the government to be able to do this. It's actually something that we've thought about and that we're thinking of developing, meaning having an administrative questionnaire that might mirror the population survey for some of those issues, notably trust towards the public. It just requires, I think, an amount of some contacts within different administrations that is difficult to have if you're not part of an international organization.
And if I can just jump in on that second part of the question, Emma is quite right. We don't yet have quantitative data on the subject of public administration's perspectives on citizens. However, our multitude of bilateral projects with countries show that there is a significant gap in terms of awareness of the importance of citizen participation and skills within public administrations to conduct effective and meaningful participation exercises. So yes, while there is a notion from public servants that they may not trust the public to make the right decision or to know what is best for them, I would say it's fairly safe to say that that is not the main barrier. Often policy officials come into the public service to serve their communities, and it's not simply because of a perception that they can't engage in meaningful participation exercises. So I think that there are many barriers to public officials feeling closer to the public or being more friendly to more participatory approaches, and they are largely, just a skills gap, an awareness gap, not or being afraid of public consultations, because in the imaginary of our public institutions, often interactions with the public are confrontational and perhaps negative and reductionistic to those high stakes, highly emotional issues. And when you actually take a public servant through the process of well-planned, well-implemented, and well-assessed participatory approach, they change their perspectives towards what it is like to conduct a participatory process. So I think that it's a much more complex discussion than that, and unfortunately, the solutions to it are also complex.
So I will pick up the question on money, but I also note that there's a question from a member of the audience who's saying, should they be the decision makers, or is this civic work? And I just want to be really clear that the role of citizens' assemblies is not to make decisions on behalf of broader public. It's to advise the duly elected decision makers, but hopefully to do so with such consequential public legitimacy that it becomes difficult for electeds to completely reject their recommendations. On the question of cost, here maybe for an OECD audience, one of my very nerdiest jokes. What is the difference between a member of the public and a first-term elected member of Congress or Parliament? The answer is about $1 million in human resources. We do a lot and should do a lot to support people in public roles. However, when it comes to inviting members of the public to attend a consultation, we're not spending $5, much less $500,000. So let's just break down some numbers very quickly. I think if you were to look at all of the OECD case studies taking place in some of the wealthier countries in the world, I think you'd probably come out with a net cost around $2,000 to $3,000 American dollars per member of an assembly. And you're looking at, when you're not dealing with national level projects, you're dealing with state or municipal projects, probably a price point between $150,000 and $300,000 for an assembly. Now, I understand in the United States, you just had a presidential election. And estimates I've seen range from about $3 billion to about $16 billion having been spent. You know, if you were to then do the simple division here, you would quickly discover that that was enough money to impanel 2 million Americans in deliberative processes. And that would allow you to hold 40,000 citizens' assemblies, which of course would be a transformational event in the country's political course. Marjan and I have done some work in this space, and while we don't believe that the answer is $8 billion being spent on citizen deliberation, we do think it's important that governments start hypothecating some of the money spent simply administering local, state, and national elections, and to put it into what we call a democratic action fund, which could be used in the space between elections to support these deliberative processes. My experience has been that any government, small, medium, or large, that commits to running a citizens' assemblies discovers that it is incredibly valuable and money well spent.
Peter, thank you so much. I'm going to ask one other question, and I think, Emma, this question is for you. The question is, what criteria needs to be satisfied to increase trust by the 40% that you've measured? Are all deliberative processes the same, or have you noticed in your research that there's a difference between one deliberative platform and another in increasing trust?
So this actually touches on one of the main challenges that we have in interpreting the data, because we're not able to kind of ascertain the effectiveness of a specific policy intervention on trust. So this is something that we're hoping to do maybe in the future. So carry out a survey experiment with a deliberative exercise to be able to measure levels of trust before, during, after for participants and non-participants. So that's something that's on our radar that we'd like to do. But the data does give us a few indications from the other questions of what might be most important. So as you might remember, one of the data points that I mentioned was that only, I think, about around a third of people felt that the government would adopt the results of a public consultation. So not specifically deliberative, but I think there's an issue of feedback and of actually understanding how the product of your work in a deliberative assembly is going to be used. And I think that's probably a very important criteria. So clear expectations, clear process, and feedback. And from the country case studies that we've carried out, where we've engaged with different parts of government who have carried out deliberative processes, the most successful ones are the ones where there was a very clear expectation at the start of how the results would be used, and there was very clear communication throughout to kind of provide a feedback loop to participants to explain, this is what we took into account, this is what we didn't, and this is why. So that they're not just left with the impression that they've like worked, delivered something, then it's all ignored and they don't know why. So this to me would be like kind of the areas to focus on in terms of increasing trust.
Thank you so much. We never have enough time for these conversations. Olin, Emma, Peter, thank you so much for your time. And there's so much great information here, so much rich information here. But Emma, I'm going to ask you to repeat one last time before we turn it to Tom Asher, the Director of Research and Engagement at Columbia World Projects, to close us off. Can you just repeat the number? I find it staggering, the finding that you have around political agency and voice. Can you just repeat that number for everyone before we close off? You're on mute.
Yes, so that's probably the biggest data point for the audience here. 69% of people who feel that people like them have a say in what the government does place high trust in their national government. Only 22% of people who don't feel they have a political voice place high trust. And that's the largest trust gap out of any characteristic. So even it's larger than for confidence to participate in politics, it's larger than for financial concerns, it's larger than for gender, it's larger than for age. So what we see, of course, those characteristics matter, but it's the way in which those are translated into political voice that seem to impact trust the most.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Tom, it's all yours.
Emma, I'm so glad you ended repeating those numbers. I want to thank all of you, Olan, Emma, Peter, for a really remarkable session reflecting on the role of trust and how it operates at the core of citizen assemblies, and not least, as Peter has reminded us, as a two-way street. And this is true not only because government officials need to learn to trust everyday people and their judgment and political capabilities, which is something that's really in short supply when you're sitting within government and federal agencies, but also if you're to rebuild trust in democratic institutions. And when I sat at OMB, I will say, here in the US, the OECD Trust Survey served as our North Star. So as we grappled with tools and techniques to engage people directly, both to make government more responsive to public preferences and to rebuild trust in the federal government, we endlessly came back to that survey and cited it, both in internal documents, but also in public-facing documents. And some of those were released in the last several days. And I think at the same time that Peter's cautions and caveats about where and on what issues citizens' assemblies work most powerfully have been too little grappled with. And I'm really glad, Peter, to have your voice here. I hope that in the future, in future events, that we can really dig into this, because I think this is absolutely crucial. Because I think at times we are now turning to citizen assemblies as a panacea, and they're doing a huge amount for helping us see the green shoots of democracy in a time when I think a lot of us are very gloomy. And at the same time, I think it's worth grappling with exactly how they should be implemented and when and under what conditions. Let me just step back a bit, because we are at the end of a 3-conversation arc that we had planned. So I want to thank FIDE North America and New America for a really remarkable and deeply gratifying partnership. We're going to drop links to the recordings of the 2 previous conversations into the chat now. And now that we've concluded the 3rd of these planned conversations, I just want to bring my remarks to an end by inviting audiences to write directly to us, to Marjan, to Holly, to Mark, to me, and I hope my email address gets dropped into the link. But if there are any future topics you'd like us to address, or speakers from whom you'd like to hear more, please write to us directly. We would like to be responsive to the goals of this audience, who have tuned in often 100 people at a time from all over the world. So warm thanks for joining us. Thank you all for a terrific and galvanizing conversation filled with lots of productive tensions, and I look forward to figuring out what we're doing next. Thank you all.